So my talk tonight is about photosynthesis, and we all kind of have a basic idea of how photosynthesis works, what it does, why it's important. But we're going to get into, like Chris said, a little bit of the chemistry, because that's my background. So I'm going to try to keep it somewhat simple, but there are some few complex slides here. My objective just for you is not necessarily for you to remember all the details, because that's not my point. The point is to show how complicated the process is. So don't worry about the chemistry and the electrons going here and there when we talk about it, okay? A deal? So the talk is regarding God's dynamic dynamo, and that's what I think I just love that concept, but it defies the evolutionary dogma like Chris was talking about, and I want to share that with you tonight. And just a little bit of a background, I do have a degree in chemistry, although it's not an advanced degree, but I love chemistry. It's one of my favorite subjects. Because believe it or not, everything I see out there physically is what? Made of chemicals, isn't it? The chair you're sitting on, the air we're breathing, the glass in the windows, the sun out there, or the clouds, or whatever it be, and you all sitting out there too. We're all just a group of chemicals, physically. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's see if I get this go. Okay. So I have three goals tonight, somewhat related to what Chris was talking about. One, my first objective is to honor the Lord. It says, "Worthy art thou to receive glory and honor and power, for thou didst create all things, and by thy will and for thy good pleasure they were created." And photosynthesis is one of those key things, I think, that reflects the glory of God and His power. So we want to recognize that. And secondly, to demonstrate how much God loves us and cares for us through what He made and through how He operates in photosynthesis in plants. Okay? That's goal number 2. And goal number 3, goal number 3 went away almost. Show how the evolutionary theory is seriously lacking in credibility when it comes to the science behind photosynthesis. Okay, so those are kind of the 3 goals for today. So what is photosynthesis? It's a pretty simple word, actually. It's made up of 2 words, photo and synthesis. Photo meaning light, and synthesis meaning to make something. In this case, biochemicals. That's in plants. So here we go. We have a kind of little diagram, simple diagram. The sun is shining down on the plant. It absorbs the sunlight, takes in carbon dioxide, takes in water, takes in the minerals, and out pops on the other side glucose or carbohydrates and other types of sugars too. And fortunately for us, oxygen, right? It's pretty simple. We all kind of know this diagram. But it's not so simple. Okay, so what's really cool about this is the oxygen and the glucose and the other carbohydrates it makes, first of all, is for its own benefit. Plants use what they make themselves. Without it, the plant would die. But it also makes food for animals and for us too. So it's kind of like a dual purpose in God's system in his organization, how He's organized his life structure in our world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And over here on the bottom right is a list of some of the minerals that we all are familiar with when we fertilize our yards and our gardens. And my farmer family back in eastern Washington fertilized thousands of acres, and they do it to provide those minerals. So that's kind of the basic cycle. But photosynthesis, Chris mentioned machines, chemical machines. I'm going to use the word a chemical factory. To me, it kind of matches more what I conceive of in terms of what the plant does and its function and its interrelationships with other things. So we have first the sunlight that appears, and then its purpose of the plant's purpose in photosynthesis is basically, simply, to convert the sun energy to chemical energy. Because animals and plants themselves, in terms of their metabolism, cannot use the sun directly. It has to be converted to chemical energy. Okay? So that's the function of photosynthesis, is to make that chemical energy. And it does it in the form of producing sugars and other carbohydrates, glucose being one of them. Those are the energy packets that all life uses to run its metabolism, the energy, the fuel, if you will. Does that make sense? And its purpose, again, initially is to run the plant metabolism. Whoops. But it's also, the purpose of the metabolism is to manufacture the plant's own biochemicals in structure, like starches and carbohydrates and amino acids and proteins and enzymes and cellulose and DNA, vitamins and everything else. Without that, without photosynthesis and the energy, nothing happens. The plant doesn't even get a start. I told you I was a chemistry major. And one of the mantras that we talked about in college was better living through chemistry. And to me, that kind of summarizes the value of chemistry, especially when it comes to life systems. You see those two little chemicals there on the bottom? They look pretty complex, right? Without those two little chemicals, no life would exist in this world. Zero, none, nada. So I'm glad that chemistry is there, because without it there would be no better living, that's for sure. And we're going to talk about those two chemicals. Those are key chemicals. An older chemist named E. Wilder Smith, he's a Swiss chemist. He has about 3 PhD degrees. He was one of the first creationists that I listened to. And he made an interesting comment that I'll never forget. Life rides on chemistry, but it is not chemistry. Life rides on chemistry. It's like a passenger in a chemical car. See, you guys, we're all a bag of chemicals, really, aren't we? That's all we are physically. But somehow there's something riding on top of those chemicals in our body that makes us more than just the physical. And that's what he was proposing, the concept he was proposing. And I think I met the master chemist when I was in high school, when I became a Christian. I think God is the chief master chemist. And you got to remember that, because that's kind of the background of this whole thing. He's the one that organized the whole system of chemical interactions and then inserted life on top of it to ride along with it. The life force, if you will. And this is really a critical verse, and I would suggest you maybe write this down and think about this verse. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, he is God. Who formed the earth and made it, he established it. 1, he did not create it in chaos. 2, he created it to be what? Inhabited. Not in chaos, inhabited. That's why I think I called him the chief master chemist, because he was pretty smart and he knew what he wanted to do, and he did it really well, and he didn't do it in a chaotic fashion, just random whatever happens. I am the Lord and there's no other. This is a very important verse, because it's kind of like the theme that runs behind. It's kind of like the operating system behind everything we're going to be talking about. So what does chaos mean in relationship to photosynthesis? Without photosynthesis and plants, our world would look like this. Anybody ever seen the Pumice Plain on Mount St. Helens, right in front of it? There's not too much life going on there. It is a dead moonscape, as I think it was President Carter? Who was it that said he was like a moonscape? I think that's true. That's what the world would look like, just rocks and nothing. No plants, no life, no animals, no fungus, no bacteria, no nothing, without photosynthesis. What does inhabited mean? Well, kind of look outside. That's what it really means. Flourishing life everywhere on our planet. And here's the really interesting thing about plants and its process of photosynthesis. Plants provide everything we need to sustain life as humans and also animals. Plants are the only organism on Earth that produces its own food. Have you ever thought about that? What did you have for breakfast this morning? Oatmeal. Where did it come from? Plants. You might have bacon and eggs. Well, that doesn't come from plants. Oh, really? What do chickens eat? What do pigs eat? It all comes from plants. Without plants, we'd look like the moonscape in front of Mount St. Helens. And one of my favorite fish is a guppy up in the upper left-hand corner, and my favorite plant is marigolds. Without photosynthesis, those wouldn't exist. So what's the key? What is it about photosynthesis that makes it so critical in this process of making it the habitation for life? Well, it's the fact that it's a chemical factory. It's a chemical factory. That's the key to the outcome of God's intention. He created a chemical factory that drives all of life and makes our dead planet, if you will, inhabitable. It provides so many things. Plants provide an unlimited list of things for us. I just listed some there. Chemical energy, oxygen, right? Without plants, we wouldn't be here. Amino acids and proteins and enzymes and hormones. There's some things that our bodies cannot make and only come from plants, and we get all the raw materials from plants. Or an intermediary like a cow or a pig or a fish or whatever. Essential vitamins, lipids, oils, fats, roughage for digestion, right? What does the doctor tell you to do? Take fiber, right? Especially as we get older. Medicines. How about a habitat? Anybody live in a stone house, totally stone? No, it's kind of wood frame, most of our houses, right? Erosion control. Weather stability, all comes from plants. Animal life for food, in food chains, you talk about plankton and the little tiny organisms that eat plants in the ocean, which are eaten by larger fish, and then I get a catch of salmon down in the Cowlitz River. This is a good plant. I love it. Nutrients for soil health, right? That's what I do. I compost my plant material. There's a very interesting verse that really strikes me too, in combination with that other verse about God creating our world not in chaos but inhabited. One of the first, actually it was kind of like almost the second commandment now that I think about it. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, and everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." He was very specific. That was his second commandment, to go out and eat food, after he said, "Go and multiply and fill the earth." It's kind of cool. I think God had this in plan all along, don't you? That was his methodology. I love it. He is the master chemist. And biology too, and the other things too, like all the other disciplines. So, when you think about how God originally created the world, he kind of created different kinds of animals, all the different animals to eat vegetable matter. You got a moose eating the grass, right? You got a bear eating berries. You got humans, there's a woman behind that bush collecting blueberries. We were designed and instructed to use plants for our sustenance. However, after we sinned, death entered the world and things changed. Now bears love to eat moose. And I love moose burgers. And it's really good. Well, and even sometimes people eat bear. I don't know if anybody in here has eaten bear before. I have. It's okay. But you know what? The problem is, this is not a good plan, right? This can happen too. So our scenario has changed in our life because of the sinfulness of man and the result of sin entering the world. But that wasn't God's intention, but still, we still have a system that we can still flourish in, which is really amazing to me. Okay, let's think about this. How did this all come about? Before we get into the photosynthesis, let's think about a methodology of thinking. What's the deal? Here's a question. It's a really important thing to understand. Evaluating the data, understanding how the science operates in light of, how did this come about? How did all this mechanism that God created come about? Question, do horses fly? Some people think so. Okay, well, actually some horses do fly. They do fly, but not the kind of horses I'm talking about. Okay, is this statement true that horses fly? Is it absolutely true? Absolutely impossible? Which would you say? You say impossible? You would think so. Now, why do we think that? Well, what we've done is we've used our brain power and we apply critical thinking and logic to what we know of science and reality, don't we? That's what I think I'm asking you to start thinking about when you think about even the concept of photosynthesis. How did that come about? How does it fit into our environment? Did it come by accident or was it intended in purpose? Now, you can decide that horses absolutely do fly depending on a need or a want that you have, or a hope, or perhaps an agenda. And that's what Chris was alluding to before. That's our whole purpose, is to help us understand that we're wrestling with an agenda out there that's trying to take God out of the picture, when in fact God appears to be the master chemist. So there's a conflict, isn't there? But we have to apply critical thinking to science and reality, and that's what we want to do tonight in this subject. So how does photosynthesis fit into the evolutionary picture? I'm a sort of a math guy too. You have to take a lot of math for chemistry. So here's my equation that describes evolution. You ready? First, you have nothing, right? And then you have something. That's the first step of evolution. You have time, you have matter, and you have energy. The Big Bang, perhaps. Well, then you have this something and it organizes itself. The time, atoms, and energy plus chance chemical interactions form, voila, as they say in math. An energy conversion system, photosynthesis, and plants and other photosynthetic organisms. Isn't that convenient? That's good. However, and we're going to be talking about this, there's something key between those two factors of photosynthesis and the plant structure itself. It appears to be, there's an integrated capability or compatibility, between the system and the structure that holds it. And we're going to be looking at that. And it even gets more complicated. So now you have something. Now, how about the first animal life? Well, you take the same three things, and we're not going to talk about that. Chris is going to talk about that next month, maybe. So the first animal life comes about by random events in the evolutionary process. Okay, well then how do you get microbes to man? Well, hopefully there'll be something for that amoeba to eat so that it can reproduce, right? And go on. So you have time, energy, you have animal life, and now, lo and behold, you have photosynthesis to go on with it, and plants. And then you add some mutational changes, mutational changes, a reproductive system, and a natural selective process, and you eventually get new kinds of species and organisms and kinds. You go from the amoeba to you and me. But now we have a little bit more complex system here, up between the plants and the animals, because the plants just happen to use the same metabolic chemicals that the plants produce. Wasn't that fortunate in the random chance evolutionary concept? Does that make sense? There seems to be a lot of coincidences that are happening on a large, complex chemical interaction scale that sort of kind of makes you think when you apply logical thinking to what we see in science and how things operate today. So that's my equation. The struggle or problem for evolution is, or for even life itself, if there's no photosynthesis and no plants, there's no plants, excuse me. And if there's no plants, then there's no oxygen or food or habitat for other life. And we come to a dead end. Does that make sense? Because all of life is built on photosynthesis, including plants. Plants are the basis for all other life. So it's kind of foundational, this issue of photosynthesis. You remember Darwin, he has this famous statement, if it could be demonstrated in any complex organ, or, and I'm inserting this, or process like photosynthesis, demonstrated that any complex organ or process existed which could have not possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, and my theory would what? Absolutely come to nothing, wouldn't it? So let's think about this. Can it be demonstrated that photosynthesis could have possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications and be compatible with plant and animal metabolism? There's that integration again and the complexity. So that's a really important question. Can it be demonstrated? That's what I like about chemistry, because there's another little quote from one of his compatriots, Thomas Huxley. He said, "The tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis, maybe like evolution, by an ugly fact." Let's go back to that original critical thinking again. Let's change from a flying horse to photosynthesis and plants by chance. Is this statement true? Absolutely or impossible? How about probable? Maybe towards the bottom, is that what you're saying? Well, let's apply some critical thinking to what? Science and reality, huh? But we have to understand also that there's others that have hopes or wants or agendas that might run counter to that, correct? I think, Houston, we have a problem. Evolution says if you have enough time, even the most incredibly complex organism or process like photosynthesis could possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications. That's what it says, right? When it's dealing with photosynthesis. Time is the valuable item. Well, photosynthesis says you really don't know how chemistry operates in the real world. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Does that make sense? And the cool thing about it, and when you think about it, if that last statement is true, then long ages is no longer a factor. Because it doesn't matter how long. If the chemistry is wrong, that's an important thing to remember. So why? So the first takeaway, and this is very important, and I might be stepping out on somebody's toes, but here it goes. This is the first ugly fact. Chemicals are kind of dumb. Well, chemicals are really good they react specifically and they react predictably, but they react and act specifically with no intended purpose or direction. They just don't do that. Chemicals do not organize themselves spontaneously or randomly to form complicated integrated chemical factories like photosynthesis. And I know that, because I tried it once. When I was in high school in 1969, since I had learned from my chemistry teacher that chemistry was really cool, I decided I was going to go make nitroglycerin because I thought it would be fun to blow it up. So my good friend and I, we hopped on our motorcycles with all these chemicals, which is really stupid in the first place, along with my .22 to shoot it just in case so we could blow it up. And we went out in the sand dunes near Pasco and we tried to make nitroglycerin. Well, it didn't work too good. This is what we got. This is a red cloud of poisonous nitrogen dioxide. Fortunately, we were about 30 or 40 feet away from it and the wind was blowing the other way. Those chemicals reacted spontaneously and predictably because we didn't organize it right. We didn't put them together in the right order with the right concentrations and the right temperature and a lot of right things. We just dumped them together and hid behind the little sand dune, okay? And the reason why it didn't work is because they just did what they did. They didn't turn into nitroglycerin because it was the wrong methodology. Does that make sense? Now, 2 years later in college, I decided that I wanted to make a very expensive chemical called cyclononanone for a research project that I was doing for my professor. And so I attempted a four-step process that took me 3 days to do. And this is kind of an extract out of my paper that I wrote for it. And guess what? It worked. What was the difference between 2 years, between the time I almost blew myself up and killed myself with this red gas, and what happened here 2 years later in college? Guess what? I studied that chemistry and I learned about the chemicals and I studied and learned how I could put them together in the right order, in the right sequence, with the right additional chemicals, with the right temperatures, the right concentrations, and guess what? It was successful. Isn't that cool? Because I knew how they reacted and they were predictable. So I was able to put them together. What was the difference? It was understanding how I could use their properties in such a way to get what I wanted. So God is the master chemist. Do you think he's smart enough to know how the chemicals work that he put together? I think he had a good clue. The other ugly fact: photosynthesis is a designed, complicated, integrated chemical factory. Kind of like my second experiment, only on a way more complicated and larger scale. To supply energy for all living systems. It's a chemical factory. So, what does it mean that it's designed, complicated, and integrated in a chemical factory? How does it fly in the face of evolutionary dogma? Well, I have an example. How many of you love freshly baked bread with butter on it? It's hot. Oh, with maybe some jam or whatever. I like strawberry jam. Oh, that's made out of a plant too. Oh, okay. Isn't that neat? This is really good stuff. It's one of my favorite things to eat, freshly baked bread. How many people make bread before? Yeah, it's really good, isn't it? I don't think there's anyone in the world that doesn't like freshly baked bread. Well, bread making is kind of a process, isn't it? You can go down to the store and get it, but it's not the same, is it? So what do? There's steps, there's ingredients, and there's steps and processes, right? You get all your ingredients together, your yeast and your wheat flour and your olive oil or whatever you can use. You can add other things to it and make fruit bread or whatever. You mix it together. You knead the dough. There's a process for doing it. You got to do it right? And then you let it rise, don't you? The yeast works, activating with that sugar that's in there, creating carbon dioxide, by the way. And so after it rises, then you put it in the oven, and guess what you get? What? Yeah? Now, it's a simple process, isn't it? But where did you get the flour from? No, you didn't get it from plants. You went down to Fred Meyer's or Safeway and you bought the flour, didn't you? I didn't. Well, you could. Well, actually, yeah, you could get it directly from the plant, but I just go down and buy it, right? So, where did the flour come from? Well, it came from a flour mill. Now, is a flour mill kind of a complicated factory itself? So the bread making process is a factory in your kitchen, right? The flour was made in a chemical factory, or not a chemical, but a factory, right? So where did the factory get the flour? Well, it made it from grain, didn't it? Well, where did they get the grain? Well, it had to be transported there, isn't it? That's kind of another little factory, isn't it, of its own. You know, you're going to have a tugboat and load it onto these barges and hauled down to and then transported into the flour mill. And it's kind of like its own little factory, isn't it? Now you got three factories: bread making, the mill, and transportation. Well, where did they get the wheat? Well, they got it from a granary, didn't they? Well, if you've ever been in a granary, it's kind of a factory too. It's got chutes and conveyor belts, and you know, you dump the grain in there, and it goes up into these big silos. And then if you go over to Eastern Washington, anybody ever seen grain piles over in Eastern Washington? I have, because they have a bumper crop. Okay, so where do they get the wheat? Well, they get it from a farmer. That was me in 1965 when I was 15 years old, and the combine that I used to run. This was way old. You probably would not have a large-scale production with this methodology. It's about 1,000 acres that we farm. But it's a combine. We supplied the grain to that elevator we saw. Is that a complicated factory? It's a lot less complicated than this brand new machine. My niece and her husband have 8,000-acre farm in Dayton, Washington last year, and that's one of their combines. Looks a little bit different, doesn't it? More efficient. Well, it ought to be. They have 8 times more acreage to do. But that's where the grain comes to feed the elevator. So that's kind of like its own little factory, isn't it? Right? Well, for the combine to run, it has to have tires, doesn't it? Well, where does Goodyear tires come? Where are they made? Yeah? On and on and on and on. See, making this little loaf of bread is not so simple. Because without those Goodyear tires, what happens to the bread making process? Huh? It stops. It doesn't happen if there are no Goodyear tires on that combine. That you don't think about, do you? Well, kind of photosynthesis is kind of like that. You see, out in the upper left, you see a plowed field, and next to it is young wheat that's growing. Photosynthesis is working over there, creating the wheat plant. This is real plant, by the way. This is not fake. And then over on the far left, after a while it matures, and it's still green, and the heads have popped out. And then, miraculously, it's important in the summer, it gets so dry that the plant dies, doesn't it? Like Jesus said. And it looks like this. These are dead wheat plants with the seeds in the head, which I can then run my combine, well, maybe not mine, but run my combine through and harvest the seeds out of here so I can send it to the silo so it can go to the flour mill so that you can make your bread. Does that make sense? So you're here, here. And each one of these steps before the grain is an integrated complex factory. And this slide here shows the natural factory that God has established. So it is critical, and it's very complicated. And we rely on that significantly. Now we're going to get into it a little bit. Remember factories, stepwise factories. This is a sort of a diagram of a plant cell. It's actually very similar to an animal cell when it has a cell wall, basically, and there's a couple little different organelles in there. It still has a mitochondria, it still has a nucleus, just like an animal cell does, but it has another little organ in it called a chloroplast, which is different than animal cells. Well, with one exception. I'm going to show you one exception at the end here. Here's a picture of moss leaves blown up, and those little green blobs are the chloroplasts in the plant cells. Each one of those kind of rectangular things is a plant cell, a moss cell, and those are chloroplasts. There's about, 8 or 10 of them in there. Okay? So that's the structure. This is what it looks like inside that little chloroplast, in that little organelle. We're going to get complicated here, so bear with me. Okay, so on the outside of the chloroplast is a wall, a kind of a cell wall in itself. But you remember, it's inside the big cell. Now we're just talking about that one little chloroplast. It has a structure in it called a thiocloid. And I like to describe them as a series of green pancakes. So I'm going to term them green pancakes from now on, okay? To make it simple. Inside the wall of that green pancake is little structures that contain the chlorophyll. And the light comes through there and hits those green pancakes and the chlorophyll that's inside the cell wall, and we have another chemical factory. We have the basic chemical factory going on. So here we go. These are the two basic chlorophyll structures that are inside those little green pancakes in the cell, embedded in the cell wall. Chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. The only reason I show you that is because they're extremely complex chemicals, aren't they? Has anybody ever seen this before? This is really interesting. It differs, the types, there's many different types of chlorophyll. These two are the main in green plants, and the only difference between the two are what's circled there. It's just a little carbon group versus a carbonyl group. Notice it has a magnesium in the center of the molecule. It's kind of like hemoglobin for the plant, almost, in some ways. Chlorophyll is kind of cool because it absorbs light at different wavelengths. A prism or a rainbow, it has different colors in it. Those are the different wavelengths of the light. Chlorophylls absorb light energy on the low end of the spectrum, visible light, and the high end, and does not absorb in the middle. And that is why plants are green, because it reflects what it doesn't absorb. That picture is from my front yard last year. All green plant, all green except for the yellow flower and the little red flower over there. Does that make sense? So the chlorophyll's job is to absorb the energy from the sun in those little green pancakes inside the chloroplast. You with me? So we'll go back to it. The chlorophyll's inside there. That's where photosynthesis part A happens. We're going to talk about what's called the Calvin cycle second. That's the second half of photosynthesis. We'll talk about that later. This is sort of a cutaway of one of those little green pancakes. Over on the far left is a clump of chemicals where the chlorophyll is embedded in. And the light energy, you can see that little yellow light zap coming down there, it hits that little group of chemicals where the chlorophyll is, and that's where the conversion starts to go from light energy to chemical energy. And I'm going to show you, I'll go back. That little PS2 under step 1, that big glob, this is an artist's rendition of what it looks like. Rendition. There's about 60 to 80, maybe 90 different chemicals, very complex chemicals in that clump where the first phase of photosynthesis starts. There's carotenes in there, there's two molecules of chlorophyll, there's some enzymes in there, and there's some other chemicals. Is that kind of complex? And that's just the first little factory in the photosynthetic process. Now, there's going to be a test afterwards. You're going to have to remember all those names, right? No, don't do that. The point is that the extremely complex chemical grouping, 3D grouping of about 60 to 90 different chemicals. And I'll explain what they do in a minute. Here's a blow-up of that first factory that we just showed in this scene before. What happens is the light comes in and it hits those little rod-like things inside that factory, and it channels the heat energy. It kind of converts it to a sort of a mechanical vibration, if you will, and that energy is funneled to where those chlorophyll are, right in the middle bottom there, those two little green dots. And when that happens, it hits the chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll says, "Ah!" Did I scare you? Well, they're scared too, because they get hit with that energy and it kicks out an electron. One single electron. Isn't that amazing? Oh, you don't know about that. Oh, yeah, I understand. But this is how the energy now is converted from the photon energy in the light on its way to becoming chemical energy, and we'll show this in a second. The whole idea behind this is to see it's a very complex process where it's not just simple light shining on this chemical and all of a sudden you get sugars. Okay, so step one. Now, when the chlorophyll loses an electron, remember that's the first step in step one. If it just stays that way, then the chlorophyll's dead because it can't lose two electrons. It loses one, and then it loses its pizzazz in terms of photosynthesis. That's kind of a bummer. It only gets one shot. Well, there's an enzyme at the bottom of that clump of that little factory that's really cool, and it's the reason why you're alive today. What it does, you see this little equation at the bottom of step one where it says H2O goes to oxygen and hydrogen? Do you see that? It's under step one. What that enzyme does is it grabs a water molecule as it's floating by, it rips the hydrogen off, gloms the two oxygens together, and steals two electrons. And then it hands it back to the chlorophyll. Remember, there's two chlorophyll, so there's missing two electrons. This is pretty cool. And every time the chlorophyll loses an electron, the enzyme gives it two new electrons. Isn't that cool? And it can start that process over of converting sunlight into chemical energy. In the process, guess what it makes? Oxygen. And guess what? The air you're breathing to now mostly came from that process. Do you realize that? Isn't that amazing? And not only that, the plant uses that oxygen in its metabolism too. Well, we're not done yet. Because so what? We got these electrons floating around. Well, that was step two. Step three is over in those two middle blue glumps of chemicals. I'm not even going to tell you what their names are. Step three is that electron now has a lot of energy, and it goes into those other blue chemicals, and it transfers, the energy then is used to transfer hydrogens, a proton from the outside, into the inside of those little pancakes. You see how the hydrogens go from the outside to the inside. It's called the electron transport chain. Are you with me up there? Okay, so what? We'll see what so what later. Well, the electrons are not done. Now they've lost some energy. So they go down and they go over to that second green glob factory of chemicals, which is similar to the first one, except for this one, the chlorophyll doesn't lose an electron. All it does is takes the electron that was transferred to it and mates it up with energy from more sunlight and boosts the energy of the electron. Because remember, it's lost a bunch of energy as it's transported all those hydrogens in there. You're going to have a test on this, so you got to remember this. You writing this down? Okay. So then the electron now gets boosted up in energy with a new zap of light. This is cool. And then it's transferred over to the far right-hand little blue enzyme there, and it does a little chemical reaction. It takes a chemical called NADP+, adds a hydrogen, and forms a little chemical called NADPH. See that little green thing over in the upper right? And then it's done. The electron, I finally got my job done. I made an NADPH. And that is one of the key energy molecules that the cells use for energy to do their metabolism. But we're not done. Remember those hydrogens that are floating around in the middle that got transferred from the outside and it came from the water? They go over to that little blue thermometer-looking thing there in the bottom right. That's called ATP synthase, and it takes the hydrogens, pumps them back out, and it creates a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that's the other chemical energy packet that cells can use. Is that a pretty simple process? I mean, I haven't even touched the surface of what the process is like. There's volumes written on this, and they're still trying to figure it out. But you have a group of different chemical factories doing different things for an end goal of producing these two chemicals, NADPH and ATP. And that's all it does. That happens in those little green pancakes. And half of photosynthesis is done. We're halfway there. Isn't that cool? We're not done yet, though. Oh, I forgot to write the numbers here. I'm sorry. And then these two molecules are shunted outside of those little green pancakes into the watery goo inside that chloroplast. And another process starts, which is part 2 of photosynthesis, called the Calvin cycle. It was named after some guy named Calvin who discovered it, I guess. Okay? These are the two chemicals, NADPH and ATP. Do they look complicated? You remember those two chemicals I had on the very first or second slide? Those are the two chemicals. That's what part A of photosynthesis does. Now the energy that was in the sun is trapped inside these two molecules. Isn't that cool? God is cool. He did a marvelous reaction. I don't think I'd still be there in the lab trying to even read about it, let alone do anything about it. So, 1, part A, we've created those two energy molecules. 2, I can breathe again. 3, now we get into the CO2 Calvin cycle. This is where carbon dioxide comes in. Remember, carbon dioxide is sucked into the plant and used in the process. Now we're going to talk about that. So it's sucked into what's called the Calvin process, mated up with those two energy molecules, and it forms sugars. Isn't that what we want? Remember? We create oxygen and sugars in the process. So here's the Calvin cycle. Remember, I told you there's going to be some complicated stuff. So step 1, inside the goo inside that chloroplast, forget about the pancakes now because we're done with that, are some molecules that have 5 carbons in it. And an enzyme comes along in step 1 and it combines carbon dioxide and water to form a 6-carbon molecule that's not shown here, which spontaneously breaks apart into 2 3-carbon molecules. It just breaks apart naturally. It's very unstable. So the enzyme makes the 6-carbon, and then it breaks apart into 3-carbon. Then those go into step 2, where those energy molecules, remember those energy molecules from photosynthesis? Now they're used to make a different 3-carbon chemical, excuse me. You got all this now? And it makes 12 of these, if you work the numbers. 2 of them go down south and make sugar, which is a 6-carbon, in this case, glucose. Okay? Whoops. That's really weird how that works. Step 4 is that more of the energy molecules are used to remake the chemical that's the starting material of this process. That's why it's called a cycle. Carbon dioxide is used to make sugar and also to regenerate the starting material in the process. That is cool. That's a cool factory. I love that. That's a really cool chemical process where you're remaking your raw materials and you get some product out. How'd you like to have a factory that you start it up and it makes its own incoming materials and kicks out a product? That's like zero cost. This is cool because you get the energy from the sun. I love it. Does that make sense? It's very complicated. You got that down? Okay. And here is, oh, by the way, this whole process is done basically by one giant enzyme that does all these jobs all at once. It's called Rubisco enzyme. That's a short name for a very long chemical. And here is the artist's rendition of what the structure looks like. Those are amino acid sequences of various types and lengths and kinds that are mixed together in a 3D structure. And one part does one step, another part does another step, another part does another step in that Calvin cycle. Basically, one enzyme does that whole job. Isn't that cool? That's pretty efficient. Do you think that's a complicated chemical factory? I think it is. So, we're all done with the hard stuff now, okay? So, here's a summary of it. In the chloroplast, you start with energy that comes into the chloroplast, creates the energy molecules in those little green pancakes. The Calvin cycle works, and you end up with sugars and oxygen over on the right-hand side, the green arrow, right? That's the product. So the factories that are working inside this together in an integrated fashion. Then those sugars are sent into the mitochondria in the plant, and they're used in cellular respiration for the plant. In other words, so the plant can live. It needs to build DNA, it needs to build proteins and cellulose and all that stuff. Where does it get the energy? From the chemicals it just made in photosynthesis, in the chloroplast. And guess what? One of the things that's made in the plant from the energy from the chloroplast is the chloroplast. It makes its own factory. Now wait a second. So the factory that makes the energy is made by another factory that uses the energy to make itself. It's kind of like this big circle. That happened by accident over a long period of time? Well, what? Pure chance. See, it's all integrated. And then not only that, if I interrupt this process and eat that strawberry, I get to take all of this stuff into my body and use the plant stuff to run me. This is a good plan for me. I'm glad. But it's just an integrated bunch of chemical factories, that's all it is. Really simple stuff. So, summarize, you got the chloroplast in the cell. It creates energy chemicals, right? ATP and NADPH, right? And then eventually sugars. The sugars are then used in the cell to make DNA, proteins, enzymes, mitochondria, and also make the factory that makes the energy. This is a good plan. I love it. It's like self-sufficient. Remember, plants are the only type of organism that makes its own food. This is good. God was smart. I would think, and would you agree? Let's vote. Is it a designed, complicated, integrated chemical factory? Yes or no? We got 1 thumbs up. 2, 3, okay. I think it sort of looks like it. And how does photosynthesis process factory fly in the face of evolutionary dogma? Remember, we said that chemicals are what? Kinda dumb. These are really complex chemicals, and they're all chemicals. Every one of them is a chemical. And they're just doing what they normally do, and if they weren't organized, we'd have a gooey mess. Maybe that's what happens when a plant decays. Oh, that could be. I never thought about that. Like Goodyear tires on a combine, remember that? It's a factory. If one tiny amino acid in one of those enzymes, that Rubisco, for example, that does the Calvin cycle, if one of those is missing or out of place, the entire photosynthetic process comes to a screeching halt, and we all die. All complete functioning types and sequences of chemical factories have to be placed in place, functioning, what? At the start. Functioning photosynthesis supplies energy to the plant's metabolism, but the plant's metabolism forms and sustains photosynthesis. Which came first? They have to be integrated together, functioning together from the start. It's a common theme in living cells, no matter what we talk about. The last talk I gave was about reproduction. Same problem in reproduction. It's a chemical process that begs the question. The plant's DNA defines this photosynthesis factory structure, yet the energy from the photosynthesis is required for the DNA to be manufactured and maintained and function. So which came first? The factory generates the products, and the products are used to make the same factory. Houston, I think we have a problem if it's not a designed process. It's all or nothing. If any of these problems happens, no energy, no plants, no life. If any of these problems happen, it seems to me that the evolutionary process for photosynthesis is DOA. It just doesn't follow logical science. Either the evolutionary theory needs to be revised or it needs to be scrapped. And so far, they have no other alternatives to say, other than to say that it happened over a long period of time randomly. The reason why it happened by evolution is because it exists. That is not a good reason. This is one of my favorite comics in the whole world. Garfield's model of evolutionary origins. Garfield's History of Cats. The very first cat crawled out of the sea about 10 million years ago. Pretty fortunate. But fortunate for him, it was only about another 15 minutes before the first mouse crawled out. This is a good plan for Garfield. Sorry for your mouth. Notice the saber-toothed teeth on Garfield. Fortunately for the evolutionary theory, chemical elements form complex, integrated biochemicals contrary to chemical science. Plants evolved first, then another 15 minutes, animals evolved with complementary metabolisms. Isn't that the same thing as Garfield's experience? Seems to me there's a little bit of a problem when you apply logic and science to those chemical factories. This is an interesting animal. It's a sea slug, a specific species, or group of sea slugs. Is it a plant or is it an animal? Why is it green? or have a green tint to it? Anybody have an idea? Well, it's got a lot of green to it too. The reason is because it's half plant and half animal. Or really? Well, not quite. It actually is an animal. When it's born, it's not green. It's kind of whatever, yellow or pink or whatever it is. What it does is the immature sea slug eats algae, which are what? Green plants. And guess what it does? It loves algae. It takes all the proteins and all that stuff in there and the carbohydrates, and it chews them up and eats them up and uses it for its own body functions, except for chloroplasts. And what it does is it takes the intact, complete chloroplast and integrates it into its body tissues with special proteins that were there when it was born. And it utilizes the chlorophyll, it then, sun hits the chloroplast in its body tissues and generates sugars and energy molecules for the sea slug. Isn't that interesting? But it wasn't born with any. It had to eat plants, and it steals the chloroplast intact without digesting them. That is cool. I love this animal. This is really a good one. So maybe what you could do is go home quick and eat some vegetables tonight, and if you turn green, you're probably going to be okay. Well, maybe not. But at least this guy was designed to do that. Isn't that neat? We're done, pretty much. The slaying of a beautiful hypothesis, evolution, when it comes to photosynthesis. One, these are the two takeaways I think that's really important. One, for you to remember, chemicals are kind of dumb. They don't form complicated chemical factories by themselves. That's number one. Number two, photosynthesis is a designed, complicated, integrated system of factories, chemical factories, supplying energy to living systems, plants, animals, and us. Chemicals are dumb. Photosynthesis is a chemical factory that's very complicated. When you come to thinking about this, applying logic, you say, well, evolution didn't do it. Who else had a hand in it? Well, we can use our Christian faith to apply rationality and reasonableness, and we know about God a little bit from the Bible, and we see His evidence everywhere else, so we might be able to accomplish a task of figuring out how it was done. Maybe God had something to do with it. Remember that verse? He created the world. What, in chaos? No. He created it to be what? Inhabited. I am the Lord, and there's no other. Evolution did not do it. I did it. That's what he's claiming here. He formed it to be inhabited, what? So we could have a relationship with him. That's why he made this universe. That's why he made plants, so that we could have a relationship with him. And that's why Jesus came to reestablish our relationship with God. Correct? God gave us plants to thrive physically. God gave us the bread of life to thrive spiritually. Isn't that interesting? Jesus was not, when he called himself the bread of life, he did it for a reason. He realized what God was doing. Because guess what? He's the chief master chemist himself. So he knew what was going on. So my challenge to you all is the question, have you received Jesus, the bread of life, for yourself? This is a really important verse in Hebrews. And just as it is appointed for men to die once, and after that comes the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, he already did that, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Jesus died for us on the cross to take the penalty for our sin and rebellion against God, didn't he? And he was raised from the dead so he might have a new life in fellowship with God. are you, me, waiting on and trusting Jesus? That's the real critical question. That's the outcome of the talk, in my opinion, about photosynthesis. This is the question that's really challenging us. And he's waiting for us. So, we've learned a little bit about photosynthesis. It's a very complicated factory. Chemicals are done. They don't do it on their own. God had to intervene or use the chemicals he made for a specific purpose to create life for us, an inhabited place. And we need to keep those things in mind when we're confronted and refuting the evolutionary theory, because there is no answer to that inside the evolutionary model. Because chemicals are dumb. The evolutionary theory ignores real chemistry. I like to ask these questions. This was from Mike Riddle. He shared this a long time ago. How do you know it's true when you're confronted with those things? Has it ever been observed? Does it match real science? Are you making any assumptions? Kind of interesting questions. I like these two verses. Psalms 118. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to believe what men say about evolution. Because evolution doesn't match science, doesn't match reality. Come on, get a life, use your brain. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all those who have pleasure in them. This gives me pleasure because it encourages my faith in God that He is worthy, and it gives me a source of confidence in my faith, and it helps me to understand how to help other people with their struggles with this issue of, have I taken the bread of life for me? And I love this verse in Daniel. Daniel and his 3 friends were trained so that they would be what? Skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding what? Photosynthesis. Or origins of life, or geology, or Mount St. Helens, or whatever it is. Because this is cool. He didn't leave us in a vacuum, did he? So, that's the end of my talk. That's it. Do we have a minute for a question or two?
If anyone has one, we're close to end on time, but yeah, Bill.
Not really a question, but what you just said made all sense to me, in that plants aren't alive because death came in as a result of sin, and before Adam sinned, they ate plants. And somebody told me there's nowhere in the Bible where it says plants die. They wither.
Correct.
They wither and all, and death comes from sin. And so before Adam sinned, he was eating plants. So plants are not alive.
It's related around the breath of life. What organisms got the breath of life from God? Plants were not included in that. And that's, therefore, they don't really technically die spiritually. They die physically in the sense that there is a life force there, but it's not the breath of life like animals and we have. Good comment. What? Okay.
Is there another question? All right, awesome. Remember, in a couple of weeks, I'll be back to do a talk on origin of life, unless I decide to change that up. Would you close out in a word of prayer, Ron?
Lord, thank you that you made plants just for us because you want us to thrive physically so that we would be able to have an opportunity to fellowship with you. Thank you that you made us because you love us and you wanted to have a walking relationship with us like family. We're your sons and daughters. And to thank you that you made this world so that we can have an opportunity to know you. Lord, help us to lean totally on you for that relationship and honor you with understanding about how you make this physical world operate. It really does show your power and wisdom and knowledge and glory and honor. And we would just want to honor you with that tonight. In your name, amen.